welcome to Piggypower. On this episode, we're going to change your manky old worn out brakes for new brakes on your GTi6 or GTi6 brake powered stopped vehicle like mine. Okay, so we're going to change old brakes for some nice new ones just like this, and I'm going to now show you the tools you need to do this job. Tools for this job are drill with wire wheel, wire cut, hammer always, 13mm socket, spanner would do, something to turn the socket if it's not a spanner, 17mm spanner, it's good to have quite a thin one for this, some big grips, or a windy tool caliper tooly thing to push the piston back in. W40 is always handy, some copper slip, which I need some more of, some ceramic brake grease, don't worry if you've only got copper slip, screwdriver, always handy, a little hooky thing to hold the caliper out of the way, 19mm socket, and of course you'll need some discs and some pads because you're changing your discs and pads. Obviously, you know, stuff to jack your car up to, that would be quite a good idea. 19mm also takes my wheels off, but maybe you'll need a different size socket. Okay, let's get on with the job. Don't forget the sneaky T30 Torx. We always forget about that one. T30 Torx. Alrighty then, so the first thing we're going to do is take off this 13mm nut here. Now, if you're only seeing this for pads, then just take off that bolt there, 13mm. It's a 17mm open-ended spanner you get in here if these spin. If you're going to replace the disc as well, I would recommend taking both off because we're going to have a proper look at these sliders. Clean them, grease them. So I'm going to take out both of these 13mm bolts. Simples. I'm using the biggest extension I can find, obviously, to make life just that little trickier. Oh, you also notice I have turned the wheel here so that I can get myself in there easier. So now we can see, maybe you can see that the piece is spinning. So we'll get ourselves that 17mm spanner we were talking about. Hey! That's it, that held the slider in place. Now before we go crazy at this point, I get a screwdriver and I'm just going to push on the pads to separate them from the disc. And this will also start pushing the brake caliper piston back into the caliper itself. It's a good opportunity to do this because you've got leverage, everything's in position, then you can normally get it almost all the way back. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do in a little bit later on in the video is regards to that, to make that a better job. So, right, now a couple of ways of doing this. You could just place the caliper on top, like so, or what I like to do, and now I'm not saying you have to do this, just what I like to do. I like to get a little bit of a wire metal hook like this, hook that on there, hook it on the spring, and drop my light on the floor so that none of us can see what we're doing. There we go. So that's the caliper out the way and isn't going to be stretching anything or damaging anything, and you can easily just move it around to wherever you obviously want it. So that's out of the way now. Okay, now these brake pads, you can normally just wiggle them out. If not, just get your screwdriver, pull them out the way like that. I'm just pushing them away from where the disc is. There we go. And I'm going to show in a little while despite these pads having quite a lot of meat on them, why I'm having to change my brakes and why therefore it's good for you at home to service your brakes. It's always good to do that. Alright, if at this point you're just doing brake pads, and you could skip a bit further to the end of the video where we're just putting brake pads back in here, because if you don't need to get the disc out of the way, then you can leave this part of the brake caliper setup, the brake setup, which is the carrier, you could just leave it there. I'm not doing that, so I'm going to be removing this with two 19mm bolts. So for that, I'm going to be using a cheat gun. So I'll make some space for my cheat gun. There's one. As mentioned, 19mm. You could just use a big lever. They are going to be very tight. Well, they should be very tight. And there goes our brake caliper carrier, which also holds our pads and our sliders, which are these and this. Okay, so let's switch angles. So here's our disc, and you can see in the middle here we have two Torx heads. Now, if someone has been in here like a bull in a china shop, they will have probably rounded those off severely. Don't be that person. So it's a Torx bit, a T30. We get the bit square in there. We take it off. Impacts are actually good for this, as long as you hold them firmly in. The bit is good, and there aren't teeth missing on that. The alternative is you can get an impact drivers, manual ones, and you smack them when they turn, or you put just a socket on there with a 90-degree non-ratchet, basically lever, smack it as you push it, and that'll get that off. Now you probably find the disc is pretty solid on there. These discs have been on here for 32,000 miles, 3 years, so they're going to need some persuasion, is what I'm saying. And there we have it, she's off. You can start to see why we had to change them. Okay, now we can essentially now start the process of cleaning all of this up. So this is the next tip. Obviously everything I've said so far is amazing tips, aren't they? But this one is another tip. You see all this nastiness on your hub face. Now if you put new discs on this face, you could get brake wobble. You could even feel it. If it's really, really bad, you might even start to feel it just even when you're not braking. So what you've got to do, I tend to just give it a quick spray with WD, then get myself a wire wheel, or a cup wire wheel, on a drill, and just spend a minute at most cleaning this up. Alright, and once you've done that, you don't want any of that oily residue, bit of brake cleaner, clean it off, wipe it down, leave it to dry. We'll come back in a minute to that. There we go. Oh, why not? Let's put the disc on and we'll come to the pads and caliper in a memento. So, hopefully already at this point you have checked that you've got the right discs. Amazing how many times you order the right discs and someone sends you or provides you the wrong discs. There is a lot of vendors out there selling GTi6 brake discs, which are only 266mm across. Now, despite their protests, you can tell them that there was never a GTi6 with 266mm brakes. I don't care what they say, they're wrong, we're right. So don't let them believe that. Okay, so we've got our new disc. You'll notice it fits really nicely on, and it just comes straight off. That's how you know you got it nice and clean. So we're going to turn it until our two little holes for the grub screws line up, and the other holes line up for that. Our grub screws, you want them to come out next time. Maybe you'll be doing this job next time, and if not, the person will thank you. So I get a little bit of copper slip, get my grub screw and just give a little tiny bit of copper slip on the end of that. Now, it's also called anti-seize grease, I think, in some places, or wherever you are. And I tell you what, that is pretty much the true version or use of copper grease. Stops stuff seizing, which is good. Be careful as you do these up. They just want nipping. I've turned my gun down. That's it. It's literally just to hold the disc in place while you fit all the other components, because when you take your wheel off, the disc doesn't flop around. And then we're going to give it a good clean with brake clean. Now, some discs you buy will come coated with paint. Nice discs, those. I've got no aversions to those, I just didn't buy those this time. There's no need for general cars unless you're doing some fancy racing to buy fancy discs. They're just metal, there's not much else to it. But often they come with preservative oil. These have obviously been in storage a little bit longer than some other discs. Got a few spots of corrosion just occur and they'll clean up fine. They'll come up with storage oil though, and that's to stop them corroding in storage. So you want to clean that right off. You don't want any oil on your brakes. Others are painted. Just give them a quick squirt and clean if they're painted. You don't need to get the paint off. The paint will come off as you apply your brakes for the first few times, essentially. Okay, let's take the caliper carrier just over to the workbench, clean that puppy up. Alright, so with our pad carrier here, you want to clean up these faces, basically, where the pads sit. So you could use a little scraper, wire brush. I cheat, use a wire wheel on a drill, get them nice and clean. I don't tend to take the sliders out at this point because there's dust and muck going around. You want to keep all the muck outside. Well, you want to keep these boots fresh and clean and good, and you know, nothing nasty going on inside here. So I tend to leave those on. We'll clean that up, and then we'll come to show you what I'm going to do with these. One I'm going to replace. I'll show why. You won't necessarily have to do that, but I'll tell you how to check and why if you do need to do that. But the part number 2. Okay, with that all cleaned up now, you can see we've got rid of all the corrosion, all the muck, any paint that may have been left over because someone was a bit excited with their gold paint. And now these. So the plan really would be, and I'm going to show you with this one first, this one is, there's no real play in it. I suppose this one, I don't know if you can hear that, and some people will chase that noise. And the reason is essentially, there's one of 2 reasons. One, it's bone drive grease, which it's not, it's got grease in there, but I kind of knew this was coming. The other reason might be it's worn out. Essentially, they do wear out. So there is a bit dry of grease on this other one, so I'm going to wipe that clean. I'm going to squirt some fluids in there, try and clean that old grease out, re-grease it, put it back in. So that will be the first one. We don't move in nice and smoothly, but no play. That's your goal. And with this one, I'm going to be replacing it with a new slider, and I'll show you the difference. You heard the rattle before? Show the difference with a new one that's properly greased. By the way, I don't use copper slip here. If that's all you've got, use it, copper grease. But I tend to use a ceramic grease or a non-metallic grease to go in here and on the pads. That's your goal. All right? Got that? Good. That's got to be tip number 5 or 6 or 23 at least. All right. So there we go. So they've cleaned this one up, put new grease in it. It's lovely and smooth, and yet at the same time, there's just a slight amount of resistance for the grease that's inside there, basically. So there's no play, side to side, no rattling. This one, we replaced it, new boot as well, and same thing, greased it up appropriately. Oh, it's just lovely. It should feel smooth, but not loose. And there we go. Can't rattle that at all. So that's great. Great job done. And I haven't used excessive grease. You want to wipe off excessive grease. The reason simply for that is grease, dirt and dust sticks to grease, and then you've got dirt and dust sticking and rubbing, and that's doing no one anyone favours. So same with your pads, don't excessively grease. Okay, I'm going to fit this now back to the hub, and probably down below here I'll put a torque spec for these big bolts here. You can tell I've had these in the drawer for a little while. I think that's BCF 1339 as a part code for the new sliders. They're not actually that expensive. To be honest, most people I recommend getting a set if your car's quite old now, and if you don't need them at that time, at least you've got them spare. Come with some grease. They usually come with new bolts as well. Yeah, golden. No rattling, and then you get no delay on the brakes as well. So when they do rattle, there's movement in the caliper. So when you brake, there's a moment when the caliper will move, clunk, and then start biting, rather than just grabbing and then slowing down. So you always notice a slight delay in your brakes when they get really bad as well. Anyway, let's go and sort out the rest of this pad dilemma. Okay, if you have skipped forward to this point with your new pads, then great. You've missed the fun that we had with the disc. Your new pads will look something like this if you've ordered GTi6 pads, and you'll just need to grease the tips, as I will in a minute, slide them in, and continue. However, here's my top tip with GTi6 pads. Bear with me while I put the camera down, and so I'm not shaking around. Okay, so you've joined me with talking about what pads I'm putting on my car. So these are GTi6 Brakes, 283 millimeters across the disc, 57 mil pistons, brake great for any 306 for road and track. To be honest, they're very good, easy to service, easy to work on, parts are readily available. Pads are getting a little bit trickier to find and tend to be quite expensive. Now I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, they're not so common anymore. Two, they've got sensors on them, which, as you might notice when I took this apart, I didn't have the wires for it, and I haven't seen many cars with them anymore. They tend to break, people don't bother with them, they can tell when their brakes are low usually, because they can hear them, or they hit a wall. So I go with these, which you might tell they look quite similar. The reason they look similar is they're pretty much identical. You can see the bottom of this new pad is flatter. Otherwise, they're pretty much identical. They don't have the sensors. These are from a Clio Sport, basically. I think it's the 172. I think the 182s did have similar as well, depending on the version. But Clio 172 have these pads. They are everywhere. Much cheaper to buy at better brands, and for track spec pads, there's so many more available than for the GTi6, and they're cheaper. Now, there's another advantage, but the only real disadvantage to them is width-wise. You can see, and here, there's a slight rattle. So, you buy this, the BPF 1609 pad fitting kit. It comes with the shims you'd use for that Clio. Okay, so pads and shims from the Clio 172 Sport, and you only need one shim per side, not four. So you and a mate got a GTi6, well, you can either have spare shims or you can give him a pair. These were a couple of quid. These pads for the same quality were £13–14 cheaper than the GTi6 ones. A couple of quid for these, and the advantage is that actually these pads cover a larger surface area of the disc than the GTi6 ones, so you'll get better braking as well. So let's fit our little shims, which fit perfectly on these pad carriers. As I say, you only need, there we go, straight in. You only need one. I tend to put it on the bottom so it doesn't fall out. And then with my ceramic grease applicator, or as you can possibly tell, Sony stereo removal tool, I dab just a little bit on the ears, not too much, for the same reason that the grease tends to attract, well, it doesn't attract, but it sticks dust and dirt to it. I don't put them on the pad surface yet. And we slide that sucker in. She's not going anywhere, but at the same time she has free play to slide in and out as it wears out. Same on the inner pads. Just a little bit on those there. We're just going to slide in the same way. Now, the next job is to put some grease on those two spots there and covering the back side. But before I do that, I'm going to get this caliper back into place and we're going to push the piston back. There we go. I'm going to put the top bolt in, even if it's just loosely initially. And if they don't come with it, they should have a little bit of Loctite on, just to let you know. I'm sure pleased that I'd let you know that. I will try and find one. Here we go. So new bolts come with a little dab of Loctite. If you're reusing the old bolts, then clean the bolt and put a little drop of Loctite on. That would be my suggestion. Vibration stuff, stop stuff coming loose. No one wants their brakes loose. Okay, I tend to use a number of different tools depending on the day and how I'm feeling. These are a big pair of like water pump pliers. These will generally do the job of squeezing it together. What I usually do though, and this is controversial with some, is I will just stick a little screwdriver in behind the rubber dust seal. Don't break it, don't slice it, and a couple of squirts of WD-40. Then squeeze my piston back into the caliper, like so. Nicely does it. Okay, now I'll then go inside the car and pump that out a few times, and I'm going to repeat that process. I hope you saw that. Squeeze the piston back in the caliper with a big pair of tools, big pair of grips. You could also use one of these, which you might have or might not have. You put different devices on the end of that, and you put a little clamp on the back of it. It sits in the caliper, like so, and that would push it back in as well. But I didn't need to do that. It was quite free moving. If it's not free moving, again, give it a spray behind, get it moving in and out. So I'm just going to repeat that process. It's boring on video. I'm going to pump it out with the foot brake, squeeze it back in, pump it out with the foot brake, squeeze it back in. Repeat that process a few times, basically. Until I'm really happy that that piston is just sliding nice in and out. Right, now I'm happy that I've done that. I'm just checking that there's no WD-40 oil obviously squishing out from the caliper. I haven't overdone that, but you'd obviously want to clean that up. You don't want oil going over your brakes. Then we're going to get my ceramic brake grease, and we're going to give the back area a few dabs where the piston will be running on the pad, just a little bit, and then a little dab where each of these fingers of this caliper will also be running and rubbing. Just a little dab. When it squeezes and moves, it'll spread itself out. Then we're going to lower our caliper down over our pads, slot it in, and you'll see that there's that springiness that come from the pads that sit, the springs that sit on the pads. So you see that spring? That's there basically just to keep the pad in place, stop it rattling, making nasty noises, sound like you haven't done anything with brakes. Get our new bolt in there. Need to apply a little bit of pressure on the caliper to keep that spring away while we do that bolt up. Make it, always start it by hand, and then obviously finish it with the wind gun. And if it won't finish, obviously, because it's all nice to grease now, we get a 17mm spanner and we torque it to spec. I'll put the torque rating down below because I'm a professional and I torque check everything. Shout out to Max. Okay. By the way, usually I do torque check stuff, and I will do when I finish this video. Okay, we're all back together. I highly recommend doing the next thing before you even put the wheel on. Pump up the brakes until the pads, the gap has gone, and they're in there, and then just turn your wheel like this. So you notice there's lots of free play, it's moving nice and freely, and that's the way we want it. If you pump up your brakes now, and you just can't move this, you've done something wrong, and it's obviously binding. However, if it's obviously free, then it's good. You also don't want to be jumping in the car, moving, and have forgotten to do that, and then you'd be randomly pumping on your brakes, panicking, because, well, you've got no brakes momentarily. So don't do that. Go pump up your brakes now. As I have, or have not just mentioned, I've pumped the brakes up, and I've checked that there's no gap there now, so they're fully bled out. And you can feel it on the foot brake, you'll feel it go nice and firm. We can now just turn this, and that's exactly how it should be. It shouldn't bind at any point, it should be nice and free, and that's a pretty good sign to start with. Next job, and final little tip, put the wheel on, torque your wheel bolts, go for a drive. Now, very gently, just 10-15 miles an hour, apply the brakes nice and gently while still moving at 10 to 15 miles an hour for, say, 50 yards. You do a little bit of left foot braking for that. If this is the first time you've left foot braked, then please just go gently, just a little bit. Otherwise your face will smash into your steering wheel. So just a little bit of left foot braking while driving at 10 to 15 miles an hour. Then get up to speeds about 30 miles an hour, check that it's nice and safe, and do a firm stop, not to a complete stop, but firmly brake until you're sort of down to walking pace, and then drive on, back up to 30 miles an hour, firmly brake from 30 miles an hour down to, again, about 10 miles an hour, 5-10 miles an hour. Do that 3 times, and then drive for half a mile just to let the brakes cool, and then check how they feel. If they bite really nice, and again, your face goes into the windshield, then great. You've done nice braking bedding in procedure. If they still don't feel great, try that again, 30 miles an hour, braking down to sort of walking pace, speed up, do that again, and they should bed in nicely. New discs, new pads, they usually bed in really sweet. If you're using new pads on old discs, they tend to take a little bit more bedding in procedure. I would tend to do that bedding in like 5 times and then drive on, and then see how it feels, because you've always got lips on the discs. So there we go. There's my tips here. I hope they've been helpful. This is for GTi6 Brakes. Loads of principles here do apply to other things. And if you need help with some part numbers and other bits, then I'll try and help, I suppose. Finally, this is the part number for the blueprint part number that I've used for the brake pads. Hopefully they're on camera. I'll put them down below. And I used some DSK642B brake discs, which were Motorquip, I think. I tend to like to spend my money on the pads, not on the discs. The discs don't really any difference, so if you can try and find yourself like saving 10 quid on your discs, don't save that money, spend it on better pads. I like to use Blueprint. What else do I like to use? Bosch. I particularly like to use Bosch, but I couldn't find any for some reason. So that's what I went with this time. This is just my daily. I hope you've liked the video. please give it a thumbs up and comment if you would like any other advice, or you spotted something really dangerous that I've advised, then yeah, pop it down below and I will correct it, because these are brakes. They help you stop. Stay safe. So let's talk about brake servicing. Okay, so in this video I've shown you how to also sort of service, or at least put a bit of maintenance into your calipers to make them last longer, stop them seizing, etc. I've been very busy. This is my daily car. I don't treat it possibly as well as I treat my other vehicles, despite how much I rely upon it, ironically. As you can possibly see from the pads that we've removed from the vehicle, there's a lot of meat on those pads, particularly that one. These, still a lot of meat on them. You know, I'd say there's a good 3, 4, maybe 5,000, maybe 6,000 miles on these pads, quite easily, especially this one, about 10,000 miles on that pad. Now I have done about 32, 33,000 miles on these brakes, same disc, same pads. So it's pretty impressive. However, as you can see, they had a little bit more life in them. I'm actually changing them because the discs, as you can see, both of the rear side of the discs, not great. This one worse, and very significant lips on them as well. This one too. So what this has done is prematurely worn my pads down to the point where obviously if this was a pad warning indicator, this would be worn and pinging, and they've been squealing a little bit too. So what could I have done? Well, for the first year I had these on, 12,000 miles, did a service, and I serviced the brakes quickly, took the pads out, cleaned them up, put new grease, fresh grease, made sure everything was moving freely, knocked off any bits that were starting to become a lip. Then I didn't bother again. So for the last 20,000 miles, literally, I've just driven it and not been very kind to it. So what could you do? Well, every year, after you've fitted nice new brakes, check your brakes. Make sure everything is free, nothing's getting sticky. There's obviously been wearing more one side than the other, partially due to the disc, but maybe one of those sliders was getting a bit sticky, not allowing the brakes to free off as much. You can particularly see a nice groove from the back there. So what I could do is every service I do, take the calipers apart, grease everything up nicely, and on the discs, take the lips off. Sounds like a fun expression. I might have done it at one point on that first one, I'm not really sure. You want to wear eye protection and a hammer. And basically you'd go round, it's a bit late for this disc, but you take the lip off the disc. That means you can either put another set of pads on it, or you'll make your pads last longer. You can see there's a big old lip on this. It takes that lip off, and it will prevent the pads from wearing down prematurely on the edges, essentially. This is obviously also just maybe slightly rubbish. I mean, these were Bosch, I think, or something. Probably quite good discs at the original time. But that's essentially what I could have done. Now, it's obviously way past its use-by date now, but if there was just a tiny lip, you could just knock that lip off, prevents a little bit more corrosion coming in because the surface is still getting worn away nicely by the pads, nice and even, and you will get a bit more life out of your brakes. That's all I'm saying. I've been quite fortunate, really. You know, some people don't service their brakes at all, and then a caliper sticks, burns straight through a set of pads that have only done 5,000 miles, ruins the discs, and you've only got a small bit of life from it. Sorry that's a bit of waffling, but I always advocate servicing your brakes as well as your engine. A lot of people just change the oil and say they've car serviced. Go through your brakes. It will save you money in the long run if you just spend a little bit of time greasing everything up, checking everything's okay, get the lips off your discs, and you're golden. Don't do what I didn't do. No, don't do what I did, do what I didn't do. There you go, top tip.